Johann Wolfgang von Goethe writes in Dichtung und Wahrheit, quote, "The most important event, one that was to have the weightiest consequences for me, was my acquaintance with Herder and the nearer connection with him which sprung from it. He accompanied the travels of the Prince of Holstein-Uten, who was in a melancholy state of mind, and had come with him to Strasbourg. Our society, as soon as it knew of his arrival, was seized with a great longing to approach him, and this good fortune happened to me first, quite unexpectedly and by chance. I had gone to the Geist Tavern to inquire after some distinguished stranger or other. Just at the bottom of the staircase I found a man who was on the point of ascending, and whom I might have taken for a clergyman. His powdered hair was put up into a queue. His black clothes likewise distinguished him, but still more a long black silk mantle, the skirts of which he had gathered up and stuck into his pocket. This somewhat striking, but yet on the whole polite and pleasing figure, of which I had already been told, left me not the least doubt that he was the celebrated newcomer, and my address was to convince him at once that I knew him. He asked my name, which could be of no consequence to him, but my frankness seemed to please him, since he returned it with great friendliness, and as we mounted the stairs, showed himself ready immediately for animated communication. I have forgotten whom we visited then. It is sufficient to say that at parting I begged permission to wait on him at his own residence, which he granted me kindly enough. I did not neglect to avail myself repeatedly of this favor, and was more and more attracted by him. He had somewhat of a softness in his manner, which was very suitable and becoming without being exactly easy. A round face, an imposing forehead, a somewhat puggish nose, a mouth somewhat prominent but highly characteristic, pleasing and amiable. A pair of coal-black eyes under black eyebrows, which did not fail of their effect, although one of them used to be red and inflamed. By various questions, he tried to make himself acquainted with me and my situation, and his power of attraction operated on me with growing strength. I was, generally speaking, of a very confiding disposition, and with him especially I had no secrets. It was not long, however, before the repelling pulse of his nature began to appear, and placed me in no small uneasiness." End quote. Herder, of course, refers to Johann Gottfried von Herder, and the way that Goethe describes him often emphasizes this curious paradox of Herder's personality. He was a man who, by turns, both attracted and repelled. He has a kind of magnetism about him. There is something enlivening and enriching about just being around Herder, but he has what Goethe describes as a spirit of contradiction. He also says that Herder has a biting sense of humor, and that, quote, "he could not write a note to ask for anything that would not be spiced with some scoff or other," end quote. So even when he's asking for a favor, he's kind of insulting in a way. Herder was 5 years older than Goethe, and Goethe seems to have immediately looked up to him. But it's not as though Goethe is unaffected by Herder's prickly personality. Goethe says that much to his own chagrin, any time that Herder detects that Goethe has a naive or childlike enthusiasm for something, he immediately takes a rude and dismissive attitude towards that thing. So Goethe really loves the paintings of Domenico Feti and Ovid's Metamorphosis and the art of heraldry, and Herder makes fun of all of these interests of Goethe's. The reason why Herder was in Strasbourg was for an eye operation. Goethe's description of the condition and the attempted remedy is, well, let's just say that the medicine of the times was limited, and the treatment was very trying and stressful, and it didn't seem to be really working. Goethe attributes some of Herder's bad attitude to his eye troubles, but it seems as though this state of distress simply heightens the contrarian personality that Herder already possessed. But in spite of all of these repulsive aspects to Herder's personality, Goethe continues to meet with him as long as he is in Strasbourg receiving this treatment. He befriends Herder because he recognizes something in him, and in his autobiography he comes right out and says it. He recognizes him as one of the geniuses of the era, someone to whom the muse has attached herself. Furthermore, and this just epitomizes Goethe's personality, he sees his association with Herder as a kind of character-building experience. Immediately after recounting a rather rude joke that Herder made about Goethe's name while asking to borrow the letters of Brutus to Cicero, Goethe writes, quote, "I could mention many jokes of the kind, more or less clear or abstruse, cheerful or bitter. They did not vex me, but made me feel uncomfortable. Yet, since I knew how to value highly everything that contributed to my own cultivation, and as I had often given up former opinions and inclinations, I soon accommodated myself and only sought, as far as it was possible for me, and from my point of view, to distinguish just blame from unjust invectives. And thus, no day passed over that had not been, in the most fruitful manner, instructive to me." End quote. So Goethe learns to distinguish when Herder is actually hitting the mark, when his contrarian and antagonistic remarks actually hit on some fault of Goethe's and reveal some way in which he can learn and improve. He learns to distinguish that from those remarks of Herder's which are simply idle or provocative insults, and he tries to learn to make the experience of being friends with this contradictory spirit into something productive, into an experience that will cultivate his personality further. And indeed, Goethe gained a great deal from his friendship with Herder. It is Johann Gottfried von Herder who kindles Goethe's love for Shakespeare. He introduces Goethe to Macpherson's Ossian, and he convinces Goethe as to the merit of popular poetry, that is to say, the poetry of the people or the Volk, in German Volkspoesie. This harkens back to a very lively debate at the time, but it's one which doesn't really concern us now. But there were differing opinions at this time concerning poetry. Is there popular poetry? Or is poetry the work of a few geniuses? It would seem that genius is unequally distributed amongst the population. So how can we speak of poetry as a kind of popular production? Many would have argued at the time that folk poetry or folk songs are at best a kind of lesser art, and that the great works of art require a great individual genius. Herder's argument to Goethe was that the people as a whole could have a common genius, perhaps a national genius, that speaks through their popular poetry. Goethe writes that Herder's attitude was, quote, "that poetry in general was a gift to the world and to nations, and not the private inheritance of a few refined, cultivated men." We spent the most interesting hours together. As to the fullness of those few weeks during which we lived together, I can well say that all which Herder has gradually produced since was then announced in the germ, and that I thereby fell into the fortunate condition that I could completely attach to something higher, and expand all that I had hitherto thought, learned, and made my own. Had Herder been methodical, I should have found the most precious guide for giving a durable tendency to my cultivation. But he was more inclined to examine and stimulate than to lead and conduct. End quote. So it's interesting that one of the things that Goethe says here is that everything Herder would later go on to write about in his career, the germs of all of that were revealed to Goethe. They were conveyed to him during the time in which they lived together in Strasbourg. And during that time, Herder inspires Goethe to new artistic horizons. He expands his view of poetry, and he doesn't try to shape and mold Goethe simply into his protege, but simply to stimulate Goethe, as he says, to grow on his own. And I think it's important to mention that, as I was talking about earlier, that Herder will attack anything that Goethe has sort of a naive enthusiasm for. The way that Goethe describes it, even in his own words, for example, his love of heraldry, it's something that he took a complacent pleasure in, is how he says it. And that in response, Herder then tries to strip the topic of all interest, make it seem banal and even disgusting. And so, if we want to look at Herder's spirit of contradiction charitably, as Goethe does, it's like he zeroes in on complacency wherever he sees it and attacks. And at the end of the day, the ball is in Goethe's court because he's the one who's deciding to continue to spend time with Herder. And at the end of the day, it's Goethe who has to determine whether Herder is justly criticizing him or unjustly attacking him. And really, who else would have that authority? You are always the final authority on whether or not someone else's criticism of you is warranted or not. I don't mean that in a legal or moral sense, but in more of an existential sense. Anytime you face criticism, you can look at it honestly, and sometimes you might say, yes, that's warranted, and I need to try to work to overcome that fault. Or you might say, well, that's unwarranted, so I don't have to care about that criticism anyway. Goethe is the perfect person, in some sense, to take Herder's slings and arrows because of his attitude towards life, his desire to take everything that happens to him and make it productive, make it bear fruit of some kind. Now, philosophically, Herder is an interesting character. As Goethe records, during the time when Herder lived with him, he was writing an essay with the aim of submitting it to a competition in Berlin. The topic was the origin of language. Goethe says that this topic did not really interest him because the answer to the question would either come down on the side that man gained his powers of language from God or from nature, and Goethe says he can't separate them. Quote, if man was of divine origin, so was also language itself, and if man, considered in the circle of nature, was a natural being, language was likewise natural. These two things, like soul and body, I could never separate. End quote. Furthermore, he admits, he did not possess a high enough degree of expertise to judge Herder's treatise, but he says that it was of special help in strengthening his mind, and so he simply offered Herder an encouraging and congratulatory word, which he says was met with scolding and blaming, which is the way it always was with Herder. If you praised him, whether the praise was conditional or unconditional, he always seemed to respond with a jab. I bring up Herder's essay here, however, because Goethe summarizes its central thesis as, quote, man as man could and must have attained to language by his own powers, end quote. Unlike Goethe, Herder found language to be of the greatest importance philosophically, and his ideas on language relate to his views on Volkspoesie and the idea of there being a kind of national artistic or poetic genius. And I think a lot of this has to do with his studying under Hamann, which we will discuss in a bit. Hamann was another German philosopher who was very concerned with the problems of language. In fact, he might even be one of the first people in the modern era to give significant attention to philosophy of language. Herder argued that one's view of the world is mediated through language, and he called language the organ of understanding. And through this description, we can understand what he means when he says that language develops naturally, the same way all our other organs develop naturally. For Herder, the world is understood according to a shared way of understanding that is possessed by a group that speaks a common language. It's a kind of linguistic relativism. But Herder would take it further than this. He puts forward the concept of a Volksgeister, the spirit of a given people. This spirit of a people is created by shared experiences, by common traditions, by shared aesthetics and artistic styles and ideas, shared religion, and of course shared language is a central part of this. It's a central idea for Herder because it's the best way to understand what it means to share a kind of common spirit with someone. A nation is more than a mere linkage of biological similarities. It also involves this shared understanding, this shared consciousness of reality or shared perspective. It's also worth noting that this outlook ties into Herder's politics. In modern language, he is certainly a populist, a nationalist, a nativist. Now, the circumstances of his time are very different from ours. Germany is not a united country at this time. The German people live under this patchwork political reality. Nationalism for the Germans at this time really represents the aspiration to one day have a common nation for the German people, a common political nation, not a kind of jingoist attitude or imperialist attitude, at least not necessarily. And indeed, Herder himself was a true cultural relativist. He did not think that some cultures were better than others or needed to impose themselves on others. In fact, he makes the central political opposition in his work between imperialism and nationalism for this reason. For him, nationalism is the way to a pluralistic future in which every distinct culture with their own Volksgeist can live out that culture unimpeded without being dominated or oppressed by another culture. He imposed imperialism because he felt this was a force for homogenization, the smoothing over of all of these differences between cultures. The result of imperialism is a kind of monoculture. Nevertheless, his invocation of the spirit of the Volk, his nationalism and his populism will probably make some of us modern people uncomfortable, given where that attitude eventually leads Germany. But perhaps we can excuse Herder for all that, given that it happened more than a century after he lived, and Herder seems to aim at what he would consider to be a freer and more democratic world. He thought that it was only under imperial systems, or when one nationality was conquered by another nationality, that culture was destroyed and a people's identity damaged. I get the sense that he would genuinely like each culture to have its own homeland, its own language and identity, and simply be left to their own devices to whatever degree possible. This is what situates Herder in the Romantic movement, however. He argued that by accepting Christianity as part of the national character of Germany, Germany had somewhat diluted the German Volksgeist by giving itself a shared religion with the rest of Europe and making part of the German identity this ideology, this set of traditions and customs that is transnational. And the Enlightenment is therefore a further step in that process. The Enlightenment represents the ascendance of a kind of transnational intellectual culture. And it comes with these notions such as the belief of Kant that, perhaps in the future, one day we could establish a perpetual peace under a vast network of alliances with the Enlightenment morality ruling over all of them. This all threatens to take us further into the process of homogenization. Herder is thus romantic for a different reason than someone like Jacobi, who wants to reject the philosophical pursuit of truth because it lacks the anchoring power of faith or the vitality of feeling, leads us to affirm a philosophical God that might as well be a God of nothing or a God that just represents material reality. Jacobi was suspicious of the Enlightenment because reason was insufficient for living or even for knowing the truth. Herder was suspicious of it because the age of rationalism seemed intent on uprooting the belief in these provincial customs and traditions. It seemed intent on viewing every human being as simply a rational individual without taking account for what Volk he was a part of, what language he speaks, what religious traditions he comes from, all of which Herder thinks are inseparable from the so-called individuality of that person. The rationality of that individual is a part, but it's a very small part of what makes them an individual. And so Herder, like many of the German Romantics, valued religion, but not because religion was a better route to the truth than reason was, but because it's part of the Volksgeist. And so Herder questioned the really core Enlightenment notion that a human being can just be an individual, rational being. That thought itself is just this kind of universally translatable activity and operation, that there's no rootedness in shared experience or shared language or shared codes of signifiers, not even to speak of the word concepts, right, but shared signifiers in the aesthetic realm and the religious realm. All of these are part of how we think. And so the modern notion that on the inside we're all just essentially the same, that we all have the same cognitive equipment, the same representation of the world, Herder would roundly reject. For him, thought thinks through language, which develops in a specific place and time, and makes reference to specific concepts and perspectives. So there is no fungibility to thinking. He would assert that we can't all just be rational individuals, because what constitutes rationality is not an individual thing. It's something that you get as part of a shared and particular identity. Now, despite not understanding the importance of language to the degree that Herder does, Goethe sees the connection with Herder as one of the most important events in his life. And while he didn't exactly remain close friends with Herder, they remained cordial, but they drifted apart, so to speak. Herder influenced Goethe in another rather significant way, which also reveals to us another sense in which Herder was a somewhat unconventional romantic, and that is Herder's reading of Spinoza. Unlike romantics such as Jacobi or Klopstock, Herder was a Spinoza defender. We discussed the pantheism controversy in the previous part, and with that controversy in mind, the way that Herder puts forward his arguments on Spinoza will, I think, make a great deal more sense. The best work for examining Herder's defense of Spinoza is in his book, God, Some Conversations. Here we have a dramatized dialogue between two characters, Philolaus and Theophron. And right from the beginning of the second conversation, the character Philolaus outright rebuts all of those, like Jacobi, who had tried to argue that Spinoza was some sort of masked atheist, that his pantheism amounts to nothing more than materialism. Herder writes, quote, "Here I am with my Spinoza, but almost more in the dark than I was before. It is plain on every page that he is no atheist. For him, the idea of God is the first and last, yes, I might even say the only idea of all, for on it he bases knowledge of the world and of nature, consciousness of self and of things around him, his ethics and his politics. Without the idea of God, his mind has no power, not even to conceive of itself. For him, it is well nigh inconceivable how men can, as it were, turn God into a mere consequence of other truths, or even of sensuous perceptions, since all truth, like all existence, follows only from eternal truth, from the eternal, infinite existence of God. This conception became so present, so immediate and intimate to him, that I certainly would rather have taken him to be an enthusiast concerning the existence of God than a doubter or denier of it. He places all mankind's perfection, virtue, and blessedness in the knowledge and love of God, and that this is not some sort of mask which he has assumed, but rather his deepest feeling is shown by his letters. Yes, I might even say by every part of his philosophical system, by every line of his writings. Spinoza may have erred in 1,000 ways about the idea of God, but how readers of his works could ever say that he denied the idea of God and proved atheism is incomprehensible to me." End quote. It's hard to read this paragraph as anything other than a direct rebuke to Jacobi, and this typifies much of the dialogues in Conversation 2 of God, Some Conversations. The characters essentially express bewilderment that anyone could mistake Spinoza for anything other than the God-intoxicated man that Novalis would eventually call him. Herder essentially tries to penetrate through all the geometric and systematic language of Spinoza. He even overlooks what he sees as the fundamental flaws of Spinoza's work, regarding, for example, the way he understood extension. Herder wants to cut to the heart of Spinoza's philosophy, not to quibble over these things. Where previous philosophers were confounded with Spinoza's categories, or failed to understand the way in which his system was designed in response to Descartes, Herder argues for an undergirding insight which can be perceived by the discerning eye that shines out of all of these geometric proofs. After all, as he argues, Spinoza's times were merely the childhood of natural science, and every metaphysics with an insufficient foundation of natural science must, to some extent, grope about in the dark. Spinoza's philosophy for Herder is a sincere profession of theism taken to an elegant logical conclusion. God is and must be the immanent cause of all things. God is everywhere. He exists at all times and all places. God is all-powerful. Nothing happens without his sanction and outside his will. God is all-knowing. Nothing escapes his plan for creation. Finally, God is eternal and unchanging. And simply as a logical consequence of all of this, the traditional theological argument that God was not an immanent cause, but a transitive cause, must be false. Quote, "A creature without his support is nothing, and how can he be transitive who has no place, leaves no place, in whom there can be no change, nor alteration?" End quote. So God is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. He's omnipresent at all times. He can't leave somewhere. He can't not be present. If he were indeed omnipresent at any time, then he must be omnipresent for all time. Furthermore, God must be in the world and not outside the world. For, quote, "Where is there a place out of the world? The world itself and space and time therein, the sole means by which we measure and count things, all exist only through him, the infinite one." End quote. Further, as God is eternal and unchanging, there cannot be a time before the world existed, during which only God existed and then decided to bring forth the world. Chronological time is part of the world, and to say it began at some point would be a logical absurdity. Quote, "God spent no quote-unquote eternity in solitary thought. There was no now and no before there was a world. God's eternity is not a birthless time, and there is no course in it. The eternal can as little become time as time become eternity, or the finite become infinite." End quote. So God is in all things, causing all things at all times. He is perfectly within the world. There is no world without God and no God without world. But even here, Herder hasn't really pulled out the pure essence of Spinozism as he sees it. Because the essential thought of Spinozism, its ruling thought, can be stated even more purely than this. There is a unity of spirit and matter, and therefore a unity of being. In the dialogue, Theophron asks Philolaus about the, quote, "intermediate conception between spirit and matter," end quote. Philolaus answers him and says that Spinoza himself did not fully come to understand this idea, that he searched for it in vain, but that this is the insight, this is the intermediate conception between spirit and matter that one can glean from Spinoza. Quote, "Substantial forces. Nothing is plainer than this, and nothing gives the Spinozistic system itself a more beautiful unity. If his deity comprises within himself infinite attributes, each of which expresses an eternal and an infinite essence, then we no longer have to assert two attributes of thought and extension which have nothing in common. We dispense with that offensive and inappropriate word attribute entirely, and replace it with the doctrine that the deity reveals himself in an infinite number of forces, in an infinite number of ways. Furthermore, this infinity of forces in God, which expresses his essence, has no limits whatever, although it reveals the same God everywhere. Thus, we must not enviously inquire of any other universe how the deity has revealed himself in it. Everywhere it is the same as here. Everywhere organic forces alone can be active, and every one of them makes attributes of an infinite God known to us. You see, my friend, what a fine inference as to the inner unity of the world follows from this. The world is not held together by space and time alone, as if by external conditions, but much more intimately by its very essence, by the principle of its own existence, since everywhere only organic forces may be at work in it. In the world which we know, the power of thought stands highest, but it is followed by millions of other powers of feeling and activity, and he, the self-dependent, is power in the highest and only sense of the word. That is, the primal force of all forces, the soul of all souls. Without him, none of them came into being. Without him, none are active. And all in their innermost connection express in every limitation, form, and appearance his self-dependent nature, through which they all exist and work." End quote. There's so much here in Herder that I think Nietzsche would have really appreciated, and I'm not sure if he actually read this particular work, but it seems that his overall view of Herder was rather dismissive, as a matter of fact. But the idea we get here is a conception of the world as infinite forces. They are still substantial forces, so they're being tied back to that monistic substance, which in this case is God, which means Nietzsche necessarily goes a step beyond this with the will to power because there's no substance, there's no center, there's no one principle. I mean, will to power, I guess you could say, is a one descriptive principle, but what power means and what willing means in each case is never predetermined. So in a way, it's not really one principle. Or rather, to the extent that it is one principle, it's a principle of multiplicity, of difference, of plurality. But in spite of this, we even have the language in this passage that he, God, is power in the highest. For us, the power of thought stands highest, but there are, quote, millions of other powers of feeling and activity. And so Herder perceives that even though Spinoza's metaphysics grounds us in a monistic substance, it's at least a monistic substance that gives way to an infinite multiplicity and variation in types of substantial forces, forces which he describes as active. And perhaps of more interest is the idea of collapsing the distinction between spirit and matter. And I would argue it's no coincidence that shortly thereafter in this conversation, Boscovich is mentioned. Rogerio Boscovich provided a theory of physics in which the world was better described by force rather than by matter, in contrast to materialistic atomism, in which you have these non-interpenetrating, extended, indivisible units of matter. Boscovich's theory is that the foundation of reality is actually force, that we actually have these force points which are interpenetrating, which engage in action at a distance, and are non-extended, and so on and so forth. Nietzsche, as we all know, was also enamored with Boscovich because he provided a groundwork in physics that didn't substantialize the world. His groundwork views the world as force, as waves, as movement and action, rather than these distinct, indivisible substances. Nietzsche, in fact, in the passage where he's praising Boscovich in Beyond Good and Evil, if I remember correctly, calls the atom a bit of soul residuum. In another place, Nietzsche compares the atom to Parmenidean being. He thought that there was this driving sort of impulse in materialistic atomism to try and discover what the quote-unquote bedrock of matter is, if we can find some sort of indivisible unit of being as the building block of matter, then we can say that there are real things, there is real substance. But if everything is just forces and waves, I think this was much more appealing to Nietzsche, because it allows us to escape from these Parmenidean thought patterns or thought habits, Platonic thought habits that he thought were affecting the way that we were even practicing science, doing physics. Now, to take a step back here and consider Herder's broader philosophy, I'm sure some of you may wonder how this pantheist vision of the world interacts with Herder's nationalism and his ideas of linguistic and national relativism. He thinks that our truth is mediated through this shared understanding of language, and yet he's willing to go with this pantheist view of God, this view of God that transcends any particular religion, any particular provincial or national tradition. Indeed, it even transcends any, what might we say, like way of talking about God, the language that we use, the particular language for God that is proper to each culture. Spinoza is certainly a product of the Enlightenment, reaching for some sort of rational, universal, geometric language for talking about God. So how does this all interact within Herder's philosophy? Strangely enough, or perhaps not so strangely, he ends up at a position not unlike that of Lessing, in which he sees all nations and peoples as in a way analogous to the modifications of God or nature. There is this one truth, this demonic essence within everything, and yet the world as we experience it is not a monism. It manifests in many different forms, different instantiations. So each Volk has its own bounded understanding of the world through language, the organ of knowledge, each people its own finite conceptions for attaining to an understanding of a world that is ultimately infinite. And I think if Herder were a kind of nationalistic chauvinist or a nationalist with imperialist ambitions, his Spinozism would conflict with this idea as regards the nation and the Volksgeist. But given that he is a pluralist and believes in letting each different modification, each people flourish in their own way, I think his view is quite coherent. Whether we find ourselves in agreement with it or not, it at least makes sense. Now, from the research I've done, it seems as though Goethe didn't read much of Spinoza's work on his own. He would sometimes skim through it or meditate on a postulate or two to strengthen his mind, as he says here, something of that nature. But primarily, he seems to have received his understanding of Spinoza through Herder. It is this Herderian version of Spinoza that we find in God, Some Conversations, that really resonated with Goethe. Herder's interpretation reveals Spinoza's system as producing a world of substantial forces, which is not a dead world of matter, it's not a rarefied world of spirit, an idealist world, but it is a world in which the divine is immanent in all things, and the finite is all part of an infinite. These bodies are all they're all of one substance with the divine body. Our minds are all of one substance with the divine mind. And I think this spurs you on to a kind of reverence for nature, if you take it very seriously, but also inclines you to appreciate a power beyond mankind that is perhaps within us, but something greater than us, that drives human beings to desire to act, that accounts for strokes of genius and sudden inspiration, and indeed animates and activates all living things. How would one name such an essence, such a force behind the world? Goethe, as we know, will later christen this idea with the name Daemonic. But even this, it seems, is something that he got from Herder. Herder also used the term demonic in connection with the idea of genius. Again, the discussion of genius was a big topic in Germany at this time, but Herder spoke about it in the language of that Greek term for a kind of intercessory force or being, we might say an intermediary conception between the human and the divine, or we might say matter and spirit. The intermediary is, we might say, the thing that unifies them both, that allows them to commune, that brings them together. Where did Herder get this concept? Why was he referring to genius by reference to the ancient Greeks? Well, to understand this, we have to look to another figure, who we've only mentioned thus far in passing, Johann Georg Hamann. He was Herder's mentor, but his influence was not limited to Herder by any stretch. He was very influential on Hegel. He also knew Kant personally. He was the one responsible for waking Kant from his dogmatic slumber by introducing him to Hume. He also introduced Kant to Rousseau, perhaps the most famous romantic writer, who ends up being massively influential on Kant. It's funny that Hamann's efforts in this respect, I can only imagine that he wished to introduce Kant to Rousseau, perhaps to disabuse him from the notion that reason can answer everything. Hume thinks we can't really have certainty in the realm of knowledge. Rousseau thinks that the arts and sciences have not advanced mankind. And Hamann introduces Kant to all of this, but Kant's autistic response to this is to produce the most logical, systematic philosophy ever created up to that point. So, be careful who you introduce your friends to, which philosophers you turn them on to, because you'll never know how they'll be used. Now, Hamann was definitely part of the Romantic zeitgeist, and he's a key player in German idealism, but he's an often overlooked part of it, unfortunately. And even in this episode, we're going to have to mostly overlook Hamann because his influence is only sort of orthogonal to the topic at hand. But I do want to eventually do a full episode on Hamann. They called him the Magus of the North. He was just this incredibly influential, profoundly influential character who is just under-discussed today. Hamann had written a treatise in 1759 entitled Socratic Memorabilia, which focused on the daimon of Socrates. Hamann's argument is that Socrates' daimon was a guiding impulse or instinct which checked his reason or his intellect. If we recall Nietzsche's assessment of Socrates as a person with a kind of monstrous inversion of conscience and intellect, such that he has an active intellect and a reactive instinct, we find that Hamann is on the same page. But rather than focusing on how Socrates' physiology makes the instincts reactive, which is Nietzsche's concern, Hamann's concern was that Socrates has a kind of pre-rational and indeed non-rational check on his intellectual activity. He has an infallible moral guide that regulates his intellect and prevents him from running astray of his moral duties. And Hamann therefore interprets Socrates' daimon from a very romantic lens as part of a story of the regulation of the intellect by feeling, the regulation of the mind by impulse, or just something within that's pre-rational. And perhaps even more importantly, he explicitly described the daimon of Socrates as genius. He said that this is what the daimon was, what we call genius, a kind of inspiration beyond our understanding, a motivation or drive beyond one's will, a kind of natural tendency or talent for something that wasn't learned but simply emerges. What we call genius, therefore, the Greeks called daimon. Herder, accordingly, as a student of Hamann, associated daimon with the heavenly gift of genius. And we can't really separate all of this from the cultural moment and the Hellenism that was just rampant in Germany at this time. It was the tyranny of Greece over Germany, and this was by no means limited to just the work of Goethe and Winckelmann and a few others. Hellenism was simply in the oxygen. And so when we look to Herder's interpretation of Spinoza, we can see the way that he describes the essence of nature as these active, creative forces, immanent in everything, ever-present in all mankind and in all nature. And you just can't help but think of his conception of the Daemonic as genius. And so there's a kind of irony here, because Hamann was a Christian who advocated for pietism, the new religious movement that privileged living over rigorous doctrine and focused on heartfelt and sentimental religious faith. Basically, a starkly romantic era form of Christianity. In all content, Hamann's philosophical attitude is not really that far from Jacobi's. He essentially thought that Enlightenment rationality was leading civilization astray for many of the same reasons that Jacobi posited. Reason alone cannot convey the truth. Philosophical systems will always result in a finite understanding, and ultimately, faith in God and the sentimental basis of Hamann's faith is more important than any logical proof could ever be. And in arguing for this position, drawing on the example of Socrates in this climate of sort of Hellenic rediscovery, he finds, well, the Daemonic. The very concept that Christians hundreds of years before, or more than 1,000 years, had used to describe the evil of paganism and sought to sully and ultimately destroy. Then Herder, as Hamann's student, carries forward that conception of the Daemonic as genius. And in so doing, he also provides Goethe with a view of nature that unifies matter and spirit and sees everything in terms of forces through his interpretation of Spinoza. As, there's one sort of substantial force or essence driving the whole thing, which Spinoza calls God. But I think Goethe would understand as something more like nature. I think nature would be the more appropriate term. And so, in his later years, Goethe attempts to give a description for his view of life, and he comes to call it the Daemonic, which is, as we have seen, not so much a nod to anti-Christian themes as to this romantic conception of genius that was actually brought into the German vernacular by a Christian writer, ultimately. And meanwhile, he embraces Spinoza, but not as a rationalist rebuke of Romanticism, which is what one might expect, given that there was sort of this division between the rationalists and the romanticists, and typically the romantics had rebuked Spinoza as Jacobi had done. But Goethe has this chance meeting with Herder, which changes his whole life, and Herder is this very unusual contrarian romantic who embraces Spinoza as a romantic. He basically gives us a romantic interpretation of Spinozism, and I can't help but wonder that if it's Herder's contrarian spirit that makes him want to look at the philosopher that all the other romantics hate and say, I'm going to defend this philosopher and show how he's actually one of the most profound and amazing philosophers of all time, and actually gets to the heart of the romantic vision that you want to put forward. But you just simply don't understand what he was doing, right? I think that Herder's spirit of contradiction perhaps motivates him towards that sort of view of Spinoza. And he ends up offering an interpretation of Spinozism that probably appeals to the artistically minded people like Goethe. Goethe is just romantic enough to distrust systems and the all-encompassing faith in reason, but Goethe is also just rationalist enough to appreciate philosophy for what it is. He doesn't ever become anti-philosophical in the way that Jacobi does. He doesn't get swept up in forms of romanticism that become wholly anti-intellectual or simply represent a return to uncritical faith in Christianity. In fact, it's very clear to me that Goethe is probably not a Christian in any conventional sense that we would recognize. Now, I'm going to make a very daring generalization, and one which certainly could invite criticism. But I think one of the ways to think about the relationship of Goethe and Herder would be to draw upon the Nietzschean conception of Apollo and Dionysus as an allegory for the classical and the romantic. It's not a perfect one-to-one comparison, but if the Apollonian stands for the rule of reason and boundaries, artistic self-creation, the light of knowledge, Dionysus stands for misrule, for dissolution of boundaries, creative destruction, self-forgetting, and all that jazz, right? Nietzsche also describes Dionysus as energetic, as a force of excess, whereas the normal Greek virtue ethic tells him all things in moderation, a rule studiously followed by the Apollonian temperament. The Dionysian is willing to indulge his excesses, and indeed Nietzsche says the normal rhythm of life for the Greeks is to keep your excesses, keep your impulses, your dangerous drives confined within these boundary lines, but to give them vent, to give them absolute indulgence on certain rituals and ceremonies. In spite of the fact that Nietzsche describes Goethe as Dionysian, he also freely acknowledges that Goethe holds both the classical and romantic periods within himself. He's both sentimental and rational. He somehow manages to organize all of this into a coherent unity. From my perspective, I think the way to put it would be that Goethe takes the Dionysian energy, the daemonic power of genius, which can be overwhelming. It's excessive, and it can be excessive to the point of being destructive. And Goethe harnesses it such that it serves his overall Apollonian vision of self-creation. So Goethe is like Apollo containing Dionysus. Herder, on the other hand, is more like Dionysus containing Apollo, which is a very strange thought. Herder's personality, opposite Goethe's, is somewhat aggressive, chaotic, even mean-spirited. It seems like he has no block between the first thought that comes to mind and what he says, where he just doesn't care about social niceties. He doesn't care about offending people. And above all, he attracts. He has this natural sort of animal magnetism. He also repels out of his instinctive spirit of contradiction. And so his outward form, his way of engaging in the intellectual world is very Dionysian. It's sort of self-contradictory, attractive, and repulsive. It sort of seems as though he just sort of speaks according to his instincts without a care for the rules and the regulations of etiquette or all of these things. And yet within him, he actually has a very rationalistic and well-ordered system of thought. The very fact that he reads and incorporates Spinoza and then draws a kind of Dionysian insight out of Spinoza is evidence of this. So I see both of these people as straddling the line of classical and romantic, but in opposite ways. That Goethe is the Apollo who is able to harness the Dionysian or the demonic, and Herder is sort of a Dionysian personality who deep within is actually very Apollonian and rational. And in fact, it's amazing that their friendship lasted as long as it did, that they didn't eventually come to hate one another, as what might be expected with a relationship like this. Now, there's one final thing I wanted to talk about before we move on to talk about Goethe's conception of the demonic, which is, in a way, what everything's been leading up to so far in this series. Talking about the specifics of how Goethe used the term and sort of what we can glean from the details of what he says. But it's worth noting that Goethe knew Jacobi as well. He met Jacobi 4 years after making the acquaintance of Hamann. Initially, Goethe and Jacobi developed a really intimate and sentimental friendship. The way that Jacobi talks about Goethe is just overflowing with passionate emotion. These guys really loved each other. And from all accounts, that's the kind of person that Jacobi was. He was romantic down to the very core. He was part of this cult of Empfindsamkeit, sentimentality. But over time, Goethe became a bit turned off by Jacobi's religious fervor and anti-rationalism. And ultimately, the pantheism controversy and Jacobi's hostility towards Spinoza contributed towards Goethe's abandonment of Jacobi, or just leaving behind the friendship that he had with him. And so to sort out the timeline, Goethe met Herder in 1770. Goethe met Jacobi in 1774. Jacobi published his attack on Lessing and Spinoza in 1785. This sparks the pantheism controversy, and Herder's God Some Conversations didn't come out until 1787 as a response to the pantheism controversy. So I just wanted so you have a clear idea in your head of how this all played out. But I felt justified in quoting from Herder's work, God, Some Conversations, to show how Herder's Spinozism influenced Goethe, because Goethe tells us himself, right, in reflection, the germs of all of Herder's ideas were revealed to him during the time that they lived together. And further, the view of the demonic that Goethe presents, especially according to Eckermann's account, explicitly references Spinoza, but it also seems to be a Spinozism conveyed in the language of Herder. There's nothing of the geometric rigor of Spinoza in the writing of Goethe. Not even in his scientific writings do we get anything approaching that kind of like mathematized logicizing, and it certainly doesn't appear in his conversations with Eckermann or in Dichtung und Wahrheit. So now let's turn to consider, what is the demonic for Goethe? In a way, it is his word for Herder's understanding of a life force that unites matter and spirit. And it is importantly tied to the concept of genius. It would seem to be responsible for genius. It would also seem to be, as Goethe tells Eckermann, problematic. It's the essence of human drive, but also of world events and natural occurrences. And so, like, what is it that links human drives, natural occurrences, and then also just random events in the world, wars breaking out, or, natural disasters, things like this? There's a sense in which you can only really understand the demonic as an expression of Spinozistic pantheism, because I think that's the only way to make sense of the far-reaching implications of this idea, and how the demonic can be applied to so many different types of phenomena. But on the other hand, there's another sense in which Goethe is less interested in the demonic as a world explanation, and does use it more as a way to account for individual genius. It is a way of tying genius to the entire world, but I just think Goethe is not as concerned with coming up with a logical system for binding the infinite mystery of the world. He's willing to allow there to remain some mystery in the world. As we said, he's not an anti-intellectual, he's not a pure romantic, but he doesn't have this overweening faith in reason that perhaps we might say at least caricatures the Enlightenment, even if it doesn't necessarily convey the real truth of the matter. And so there's a real importance to Goethe to the point that it's like a load-bearing idea in his philosophy. It's insofar as it relates to this idea of genius. And I think this is why he inclines toward the word demonic, following Herder and Hamann, because of the intercessory nature of the demonic, the fact that it relates the divine to the human, spirit to matter, the infinite to the finite. It's a way of accounting for when someone seems divinely inspired, but in a world in which we no longer believe in a sort of like personal God with a well thought out, consciously ordered plan for how everything is going to go, right? And so it's a way of understanding genius as like a surplus of this life force, these substantial forces that relates the individual to the divine, which is now not conceived of as a literal personified God, but relating the finite part to the infinite whole. And what is meant by this precisely will come through, I think, when we look at some of the primary sources. Now, we have examined one place where Goethe discusses the demonic with Eckermann in the previous part of this series. But here I want to focus in on where the term first appears in Dichtung and Wahrheit. This is written around 1813, and Goethe certainly used the term in some earlier poems, but this is the first time where we have an outright statement of what the demonic is, an explicit statement, and why Goethe came to this conception. In his own words, he tells us, this is how I came to this idea. And here, keep in mind that Goethe is writing in the third person in this first sort of passage. So when he's referring to the child, the boy, the youth, he's referring to himself in the different phases of his life. Quote, "In the course of this biography, we have circumstantially exhibited the child, the boy, the youth, seeking by different ways to approach to the suprasensible first, looking with strong inclination to a religion of nature, then clinging with love to a positive one, and finally concentrating himself in the trial of his own powers, and joyfully giving himself up to the general faith. Whilst he wandered to and fro, space which lay intermediate between the sensible and suprasensible regions, seeking and looking about him, much came in his way which did not appear to belong to either, and he seemed to see more and more distinctly that it is better to avoid all thought of the immense and incomprehensible. He thought he could detect in nature, both animate and inanimate, with soul or without soul, something which manifests itself only in contradictions, and which therefore could not be comprehended under any idea, still less under one word. It was not godlike, for it seemed unreasonable, not human, for it had no understanding, nor devilish, for it was beneficent, nor angelic, for it often betrayed a malicious pleasure. It resembled chance, for it evolved no consequences. It was like providence, for it hinted at connection. All that limits us, it seemed to penetrate. It seemed to sport at will with the necessary elements of our existence. It contracted time and expanded space. In the impossible alone did it appear to find pleasure, while it rejected the possible with contempt. To this principle, which seemed to come in between all other principles, to separate them, and yet to link them together, I gave the name of demonic, after the example of the ancients and of those who, at any rate, had perceptions of the same kind. I sought to screen myself from this fearful principle by taking refuge, according to my usual habits, in an imaginary creation." End quote. And that last line, the translator has it as imaginary creation. It could just be taking refuge in an image, giving some sort of imagistic designation to this conception, which almost seems to defy image, because it attempts to encompass the all, and therefore remains rife with contradiction and paradox. And we will find, I think, that contradiction is a huge part of the demonic. I mean, Goethe says it outright. But the fact that it's benevolent, but it also has a malicious pleasure. It's neither angelic or devilish. It's not human. It's not a force that can be personified. Which is strange, because Goethe just attributed at least desires or drives to the demonic when he called it benevolent or malicious. Which means he's speaking with some poetic license here, because perhaps we don't really have the words to convey what he means. Because he's trying to describe essentially a limitless concept within linguistic limits. So it's not anthropomorphic, but it's not divine. It's not reasonable nor unreasonable. It doesn't conform to some kind of natural quote-unquote law. If anything, it's a law of, again, contradiction. In fact, Goethe says it loves the impossible. It rejects the possible with contempt, which is a very strange way to describe an underlying principle for understanding reality, right? Normally, we start from what is possible in reality, and then we interpret from there. We interpret a principle from what is possible,
to describe what is possible within the realm. Essentially, that is a description of reality. You're saying this is what is within the realm of possibilities, and this is how that comes to occur. Goethe is saying my principle, the demonic, isn't about what is possible. It's about creating the conditions for the impossible. And this is part of that aspect of the demonic, maybe its core aspect, that it defies all limit. That perhaps it's the movement of all limited things to try and break the limits that define them, which again is unequally distributed. It could come out more strongly in some limited things than others. It's the movement to try and transcend finitude. And even if no finite thing actually enters into the infinite, this push, this drive, makes them into something more than they were previously. It makes them something different in the following of this push. So it's a principle of becoming that Goethe is trying to describe and not of being. In a way, we go from Spinoza's substance to Herder's substantial forces to simply force, movement, which can't be defined by any quality which is not contradicted by some other quality, and whose essence can't even be sensibly talked about. We can only describe the movement, the direction, the push from human to God, from finite to infinite, from possible to impossible. It's like providence because it connects all things. So if one were to comprehend the sum total of all that is connected by the demonic, they would have an account of the entire drama of fate and history. But of course, as we mortals stand before the canvas of reality, as Eckermann put it, we are all laymen. None of us are the master painter who is able to truly understand the totality of the canvas, the connection of the whole to the parts, the brushstrokes that brought it all forth, the theory that undergirds the painting, that connects all of its techniques. We're all ignorant of that. But ultimately, Goethe says it was the ancients, meaning here the Greeks, probably most particularly Socrates and his student Plato, who laid down in writing the account of Socrates' apology, in which he gives the story of his daemon, who provide at least an image for containing this contradictory principle of becoming, movement, and fate. And Goethe claims here that even as a young man, he at least perceived the demonic, even if he didn't yet fully understand it. He didn't have a name for it. He hadn't yet encountered Herder or Hamann, or anyone who spoke in this type of language in modern times. But intuitively he felt he understood, or perceived at least, this reality of forces, quote-unquote, behind the appearance, behind the world. Indeed, some of my favorite lines in Goethe's Faust involve the main character Faust's musings on the demonic in all but name. In fact, Faust's trouble at the very beginning of the play is that he has exhausted every faculty of the German university. He has learned everything there is to learn according to the current science and understanding of mankind. And yet he still remains unsatisfied. He still feels as though he has no overall understanding of reality. The whole canvas, right? He only has a very limited human, all too human perspective. And in those days, it was, the four faculties, the four disciplines of the German university: theology, law, medicine, and philosophy. Right? It's sort of like we've put human knowledge into these certain limited vessels. And so Faust has exhausted knowledge within all the existing limits. And now his mind is oriented towards the limitless. In the end, human beings are ignorant. They're fallible. What is there beyond this limited human knowledge? Faust ruminates, quote, "Hence I have yielded to magic to see whether the spirit's mouth and might would bring some mysteries to light, that I need not with work and woe go on to say what I don't know, that I might see what secret force hides in the world and rules its course, envisage the creative blazes instead of rummaging in phrases." End quote. So all this study of philosophy, theology, medicine, law, reading all these books, themselves written by fallible, ignorant men, even reading the classics, the works of genius, none of that delivers Faust over to knowledge, to that, quote, secret force which comprises the hidden essence of the things in the world, that pushes things along, so to speak. We might say that in a way Goethe is just attributing a kind of magical and fantastical name to the animating principle, the principle of movement. That's been a philosophical bugbear it's been a bugbear for the natural sciences even. Why is there motion? Why is everything not at rest? What is the explanation for the why of motion? What is the animating principle that makes organic matter alive and which is not present in inanimate matter? And Goethe ultimately thinks, or he puts the words in Faust's mouth, that it's some sort of blazing creative power, something that can't be personified as God, or at least isn't in this passage. He doesn't refer to the transitive cause of God, right? That's too... Well, that's the old personified theological view. That's the old limitations on the knowledge, right? Goethe is describing something that is more amoral, again, at times malicious, something which is unreasoning and yet has a providential aspect to it. It can't just be evil, even though it is malicious, because it's also creative. It leads to good things. At times it seems benevolent. So this is really grasping at the demonic as a conception of the divine, an attempt to give an account of the limitless divine in the limited framework of knowledge that somehow recognizes that the past descriptions of the divine were provincial and limited, in the way that Herder might have described with his theories of language, right? He would have fully admitted, yes, all of these different descriptions of the divine given through the provincial orthodox religious descriptions are simply finite recapitulations to their own mediation of the world, their shared understanding of the world. But that's really all that we have, because the human mind can't ever attain to the infinite. And the interesting thing, to go back to Faust for a moment, by the way, Goethe says explicitly, he tells Eckermann this, Mephistopheles is not a demonic figure. So the literal devil in Goethe's story is not demonic. So clearly he's not using demonic in a Christian sense, because the prince of demons in Goethe's view is not a demon. That is to say, he is not daemon. Mephisto is a pure spirit of negation. He says, Mephisto says, this is what he loves above all. Everything that comes to be deserves to perish wretchedly. He loves to attack, to contradict, to destroy. That is his only desire. So when Mephisto has this wager with God, the Almighty, over the soul of Faust, that's because he wishes to destroy Faust and lay him low. He doesn't actually wish to invigorate Faust or make him creative or give him inspiration. Even if Faust might use the powers Mephisto gives him for these ends, or turn his experiences with Mephisto into productive character-building experiences, that's not Mephisto's intention. And who does this remind us of, by the way? I mean, I can't help but think of how Goethe describes Herder, a spirit of contradiction, and Mephisto, who says, I am the spirit who negates. And how he, Goethe, as the artist, the creative, the seeker after knowledge, the Apollonian self-creative man, makes his friendship with this disagreeable person into a positive experience, in the same way that Faust makes his connection, his relationship with the spirit of negation into a positive experience. Indeed, it leads to his salvation, paradoxically, right? But just on a broader level, is not Faust, does he not become through who he is, through his experience of being allied to Mephisto? The strange notion in Goethe's Faust is that the sincere seeker will be saved in spite of whatever sins he commits on the way to his truth, that in his encounter with the spirit of negation, Faust continues to strive and seek and never be satisfied, and on this account he is saved. So there's just an interesting connection there of preserving yourself by using your encounter with those who contradict as part of this way of developing yourself. But more importantly, I think for our purposes, the spirit of contradiction is not the demonic, because that's not creative. Ultimately, the demonic is creative. It must be creative. That is an essential part of it. It can't be imagined as purely negative. Now, in a way, you might say it is negative, but if it were imagined as just simply purely creative and there was no dangerous or destructive element to it, that would also be a falsification, at least logically speaking. I mean, in terms of the way that Goethe talks about it, he more emphasizes the creative essence of the demonic, and I think that a lot of that has to do with Goethe's worldview and his outlook. And this brings us back to Goethe's focus on the demonic as a kind of narrative about people that we might call geniuses. It's interesting because Goethe often speaks of the demonic in terms which reach for the infinite, which reach into all the secret nooks and crannies of nature, or at least he attempts to, But I think his ultimate concern is with human beings. It's to account for genius, or to understand the driving force within a human being. What is it inside of me that makes me want to be creative, want to be productive? How can I understand this as something natural, something that connects me to the rest of nature? And again, these questions in modern philosophy and culture are simply not as pressing as they were at the time. The origin and nature of genius. Many people today probably don't even believe in genius in the way that Germans in the 1700s sometimes talked about it. But for Goethe, this is a really personal question. It kind of even transcends the cultural context. Because if I had to give a defining character trait for Goethe, it would be productivity. And not productivity in the sense of a Protestant work ethic. It's also not a capitalist form of productivity aimed at producing goods or services. We're talking here about creativity, artistic creativity. And not just aimless creativity, but a creative impulse that takes one's inner states and thoughts and feelings and experiences and manifests them in some way that makes them concrete, puts them into an artistic form. Famously or infamously, Goethe would extend his notion of productivity to statecraft, or indeed military conquest. In Dichtung und Wahrheit, he says that Count Egmont is an example of the political form of the Daemonic. In fact, Egmont is the chief example that he gives. He leads the Dutch against the ambitions of the Spanish. His fate is tragic. He is eventually executed. That would seem to be the destiny towards which he was driven. Often many demonic people are driven. He leads a great and inspiring life, but a way of life which can yield to no compromise, in which he pushes against all the limits. That's the way to think about it. And therefore, a life in which he attempts the impossible. Again, there's a contradiction here because pushing the boundaries of what is possible is the way towards artistic creation, but in the process of doing so, we often inevitably bring about our own destruction. Another perfect example of this, used by Goethe, is Napoleon Bonaparte. Obviously, Napoleon recognized no limits. He pushed his power up until the point that it could be stopped or resisted. He spread his French empire across the entire continent until his defeat. Goethe says that Napoleon was one of the most productive men who ever lived. And the important thing for Goethe is not Napoleon's political agenda or ideology or the tax policy he made. He's not even really concerned with the consequences of his actions. Rather, it's that Napoleon was a man in a constant state of action, of movement, that through his political action he creates, he is productive. It is impossible that one failed to see the demonic in Goethe's description of Napoleon as a man who lived in a state of, quote, continuous enlightenment. Indeed, Eckermann asks him if Napoleon is demonic, and Goethe answers, quote, to a degree that is probably unique. The late Grand Duke was also a demonic personality, full of boundless energy and restlessness, so that his own realm was too small for him, and even the largest would have still been too small. The Greeks ranked such demonic beings among the demigods, end quote. And having mentioned the Greeks, my mind naturally goes to Alexander here. I mean, he is a Macedonian, but he conquers and unifies the Greek world. And his father told him to ask for himself another kingdom, for the one he would inherit was certainly too small for him. There's also the anecdote that Alexander wept when there were no more worlds to conquer. So there's this insatiability here, right? Pushing against all limits, and eventually you hit a natural limit. There's just no more worlds to conquer, right? And it's a source of sadness, not of restful success or something like that. This insatiability is certainly an attribute of the demonic. It can never rest. It can never be satisfied. And again, we should certainly be able to see all of this in Faust. Once again, never satisfied, never happy. Faust can never rest in the moment. Goethe writes, again in Dichtung und Wahrheit, quote, although this demonic element can manifest itself in all corporeal and incorporeal things, and even expresses itself most distinctly in animals, yet with man especially does it stand in a most wonderful connection, forming in him a power which, if it be not opposed to the moral order of the world, nevertheless does often so cross it that one may be regarded as the warp and the other as the woof.
For the phenomena which it gives rise to, there are innumerable names. For all philosophies and religions have sought in prose and poetry to solve this enigma and to read once and for all the riddle which, nevertheless, remains still unriddled by them. But the most fearful manifestation of the demonical is when it is seen predominating in some individual character. During my life, I have observed several instances of this, either more closely or remotely. Such persons are not always the most eminent men, either morally or intellectually, and it is seldom that they recommend themselves to our affections by goodness of heart. A tremendous energy seems to be seated in them, and they exercise a wonderful power over all creatures, and even over the elements. And indeed, who shall say how much farther such influence may extend? All the moral powers combined are of no avail against them. In vain does the more enlightened portion of mankind attempt to throw suspicion upon them as deceived, if not deceivers. The mass is still drawn on by them. Seldom, if ever, do the great men of an age find their equals among their contemporaries, and they are to be overcome by nothing but by the universe itself. And it is from observation of this fact that the strange but most striking proverb must have risen, Nemo contra Deum nisi Deus ipsi, end quote. And it's a bit funny because that last saying, he says, this is how it must have come about. This is how it must have emerged or risen. But that last saying, it translates to, no one can oppose God except God himself. And he gives it in Latin, but it seems to be Goethe's own coinage. So, he says, this is how this must have come about, but it seems like he came up with it himself. Which, fair enough. I guess if Goethe sees the source of all creativity within him as coming from this demonical essence, then I guess it really doesn't come from Goethe himself. So only the will of God can oppose the will of God. Only the universe itself can oppose a force of nature like a demonic man. They're a piece of fate, and they will push and overcome and strive and create until the conditions of fate finally destroy them. And that's part of their essential place, or their what they represent in the overall tapestry or the story of existence, I would contend. Their destruction always comes from their own inability to moderate their demonic impulses, their demonic drive. And therefore, the fact that the demonic always makes you, to a certain extent, imprudent or even self-destructive, that's all par for the course. And all demonic individuals are almost always brought down by continuing to push everything to its limits, indeed beyond the limits, even when prudence and good sense or morality tells them that they have to check themselves. The purely demonic person is basically unable to check himself. Again, as a force of nature, that would be like, expecting the river to stop surging, the wildfire to stop burning, the avalanche to stop tumbling. It just can't. Now, you could draw political implications from this, but I think this interpretation of Napoleon really just comes out of Goethe's own life experience, and it's an analogy he's making from his own inner drive. The fact that Goethe feels he is a restless spirit who is never happy unless he's being productive. He draws on his own inner experience in order to represent to himself what genius means in a general form. That this inner drive must be manifest in other human beings, and furthermore that it must in some way be a connection to the sublime and dangerous power of nature. It's the fire in our furnace, we might say, which burns more strongly in some than in others. And this fire, if you let it get out of control, can overwhelm you and consume you. You can become immolated within your own demonic fire. That's why he calls it problematic. It leads to tragic ends. And essentially, the person who's possessed with genius or with demonic energy is sort of riding a line their whole life, walking a razor's edge, trying to harness this creative power just up to the point that it doesn't destroy you, trying to keep the fire burning just hot enough that it keeps pushing you forward without consuming you. And the longer you can hold to this equilibrium, the longer you can survive and be productive. The other side of it, too, is just letting the flame go out, right? Just sort of resigning yourself to living the life of quiet desperation that I believe T.S. Eliot is the one who said that, right? So just letting the demonic fire within you become smoldering
ashes, maybe even cold, dead ashes. And just, we would say in modern terms, just becoming an NPC or something like that. And to Goethe, that's just that would be equally as bad from his point of view, right? From his set of values and what he wants out of life. He really does hold to this idea that you have to keep this equilibrium, keep the flame burning, keep the flame at precisely the correct equilibrium so that it can push you forward but doesn't consume you. And if there is an example of how this demoniacal force can consume you, well, I would refer back to the episode that we did on Sorrows of Young Werther. Goethe experiences the demonic in his youth as this all-consuming passion, these romantic feelings for which, when you're consumed by them, one is even willing to throw away their life and say to the devil with all of society's rules and regulations, to the devil with a common person's morality, I'm going to follow feeling. That's often the tenor of Werther's rants throughout that epistolary novel, complaining about sort of the regulations and guardrails in which we're all hemmed in, and those of us who have this inner driving force are always sort of circumscribed and sanctioned by society. And yet, at the end of this road of throwing himself wholeheartedly into feeling, what is it that awaits young Werther other than an untimely death? And this is why, even though the character of Werther comes out of Goethe's own experience, kind of intermingled with the experience of Karl Wilhelm Jerusalem, it's very important that Goethe is a man with the demonic, so is his character, his fictional character, Werther. Werther is not able to control it, and Goethe is. So Goethe writes this character so he can let the demonic burn him away in the form of a literary effigy, so to speak. And in the very act of doing so, Goethe is harnessing this demonic fire for his own productivity. He substitutes Werther for himself so that he can follow the demonic as long as it could possibly go within a fictional realm, produce this creative representation of what it looks like when the demonic fire completely destroys you, and therefore to do it in effigy, as we've said, and not actually burn himself away. So he is able to pull creativity out of it, right? While also producing a representation of what it looks like when the demonic fire burns out of control. And so this gives us an indication of what Nietzsche is talking about when he says that Goethe disciplined himself to wholeness, that in spite of all his talent for artistic self-creation, Nietzsche still sees him as a Dionysian man. He has a strong demonic fire burning within himself, but he somehow manages the impossible of maintaining that equilibrium for his entire life and living a long, full life. Even though I would contend that Goethe is certainly more Apollonian, the reason Nietzsche focuses on the Dionysian is probably for the precise reason that Goethe focused on the demonic. That this is, in their view, where the action is. This is the energy. This is life. It's the substantial force. It has to be directed or mastered in some way, or it will destroy you, and that part is important. But without that life force, there's nothing. There's no creativity at all. The reason why I would make a different emphasis, though, is just because, Goethe recognizes from the very beginning how dangerous the demonic really is. He says that it's drawn to dark times and prominent figures. He says in sunny Berlin, the demonic would not even be able to manifest. It appears in times of chaos, confusion, anarchy, possibility, revolution. It appears during civil wars. It appears in the form of inspiring heroes and fearsome villains, the most consequential people and events in the course of history. But it is a kind of chaos, right? And the fact that Goethe says, I recognized this force, even as a young man, and I tried to sort of contain it within an image. So even the word demonic, even this whole philosophical discourse that I have given, this whole description is another limiting force, another magic circle, which is a very Apollonian way of doing things, right? Drawing of boundary lines in order to contain this chaotic roil that Goethe perceives its creative destruction in the most profound way. It is anarchy. It is chaos. It is bloodshed when it really runs roughshod over our moral, regulated, orderly world. And so as much as Goethe talks about, waxes poetic about the power of the demonic,
we have to always keep in mind that he holds it at a distance. He attempts to contain it. He attempts not to let it get out of control. I suppose that a final aspect of the demonic that I have perhaps not emphasized enough then is that Goethe insists that the demonic, quote, cannot be explained by reason or understanding. It does not lie within my own nature, but I am subject to it, end quote. Further, in the same conversation, when Eckermann asks if the demonic manifests in events, Goethe says, quote, specifically in those that we cannot explain by reason or understanding, end quote. When Goethe uses such language, he seems to stand alongside those romantics and counter-Enlightenment figures like Hamann and Jacobi and Klopstock. But Goethe was never really one of them in terms of advocating for a return to unreflective faith, or something like that. He doesn't even really seem all that enamored with Herder's idea of recognizing the divinity in all traditions, but remaining bound to one of them as though it were uniquely yours owing to your Volksgeist. Goethe has always struck me as more of a good European, to use Nietzsche's language. To the extent that he is spiritual, he seems content to leave his spirituality almost entirely up to the realm of sentiment and feeling, not to encapsulate it in any religious formula at all. Again, his religiosity is demonic, as Eckermann told us at the beginning of the previous part of this series. In other words, the manner of his spirituality itself is limitless. It pushes towards the infinite. It can't be contained within any such provisional language. And finally, we have to see how, in commonality with Herder, Goethe was an advocate for Spinoza, a kind of arch-rationalist of all people. He certainly wouldn't have agreed with the philosophical quest to bound the boundless. That is, in fact, one of his chief problems with Hegel's philosophy, and the Hegelian claim that philosophy had been unriddled, the absolute mind had been revealed on earth, and that through reason you could somehow come to an understanding of God and the infinite and the meaning of life. Goethe doesn't go in for any of that. But he has a different temperament from these counter-Enlightenment figures. Unlike them, he doesn't see Spinoza as a problem. He doesn't see him as a dangerous philosopher who needs to be combated and refuted. He tries to suck out the marrow from the bones of Spinoza's system. Following Herder, he would rather see the value in the core insight of Spinoza, the wisdom that he was trying to convey, rather than quibble with the project of philosophy itself, complain about the hubris of reason, call for a revival of Lutheran religiosity. None of that appeals to Goethe. His attitude is always, how can I take this experience, this idea, this friendship, this feeling, and use it to create something of value? This is Goethe's way of mastering the demonic, and it is quite possible that no one gripped by demonic drives as strongly as Goethe ever managed to master them as powerfully as he did. And with that point of comparison, next time, when we return, we're going to talk about a man who was overwhelmed by the demonic and consumed by it. You all know him. He's named Friedrich Nietzsche. Join me then for an analysis of Stefan Zweig's struggle with the demon, particularly the part of the work concerning Nietzsche. That's all for today. Until next time, I wish you the best of luck in managing the intensity of your demonic flame. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.